Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for your presence. It's a privilege to give you the last lecture for this semester. It's on season of migration to the north. Tayib Saleh was born in 1929 in Al-Shamaliya province in the Sudan. And he's of an Arab, Nubi, and Negro ethnic ascendancy. He died in London in 2009. An Arabic language novelist and short story writer, Saleh attended universities in Khartoum and in London. He worked in radio broadcasting for the BBC Arabic service. He was head of drama. The novel, Season of Migration to the north, موسم الهجرة إلى الشمال, referred to as Mawsim, was published in 1966, translated into English in 1969. It is a prose poem that deals with the conflicts of modern Africa. Some of the conflicts are traditionalism versus modernism, rural versus urban, men versus women, and the village, the specific, versus the universal. He also wrote Ars Zain, The Wedding of Zain, and other stories. Now, the best way to introduce you to the novel is to read to you some parts of the lecture he gave, the speech he gave at AUB in 1980. So the lecture was recorded and published in the casebook by late Professor Muna Amyouni. Beginning of the lecture, I had never before addressed such an enormous crowd. I don't really know whether a writer can say anything about his work, above and beyond what he has already said. I started Season in the summer of 1960, when on a holiday in a little village near Cannes. I got stuck before Mustafa Said started his confession. I fell under the influence of Freud and read more than once Civilization and its Discontents. But above everything else, the foundation of my work, for what it is worth, lies in what I am, a Sudanese Muslim Arab who was born at a certain time in a certain place. I believe that if I have contributed anything to modern Arabic literature, it is my constant plea for toleration. One of the major themes of Season is the East-West confrontation, or to be more specific, the confrontation between the Arab-Muslim world and the Western European one. I created, therefore, a conflicting world in which nothing is certain, and formalistically, two voices to force the reader to make up his or her mind. Now, we have already discussed the East-West, self-other, Occident-Orient relationship, or confrontation, if you wish to call it, in Edward Said's Orientalism. According to Edward Said, Orientalism promoted the difference between the West, the Occident, the self, and the Orient, the other, and deepened the distinction, always reiterating Western superiority over Oriental backwardness, expressing the strength of the Occident and the weakness of the Orient. The result of such divisions is a state of tension that polarizes the distinction between the familiar, the West, and the strange, the different, the Orient. He says, the Oriental becomes more Oriental, the Westerner more Western, and limit the human encounter between different cultures, traditions, and societies. We will encounter the same vision of polarization, tension, and division between the East and the West, the South and the North, more specifically the Sudan and Imperial England in Season of Migration to the North. The two voices in season, already mentioned before, are those of the narrator Al-Rawi and Mustafa Said. Critics and readers have different views on the protagonist in the novel. Is it Mustafa Said, or is it the nameless, anonymous narrator? Both stand for two Sudanese who lived and studied in England, but their relationship with the West, with the North, is quite dissimilar, very different. The narrator considers the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. Mustafa Said has a relationship of defiance with the West. He poisons his life trying to avenge the suffering of his own people. The colonization of the East. He engages in sexual relationships with English women and kills one of them. 3 commit suicide, possibly because of him. First one is Sheila Greenwood, who was a waitress in a restaurant. The second one is Isabella Seymour, wife of a successful surgeon and mother of 2 daughters and a son. The third one is Anne Hammond, a university student. Jean Morris is the woman he falls in love with, marries, and kills with a sharp blade on a cold February evening. Now, the novel cannot be understood really outside the colonial context. So it was in September 1898 that the forces of imperialism, the British Army led by Herbert Kitchener, invaded the Sudan. Muhammad Ahmad, a religious leader who challenged the power of British occupation of Egypt and was able to end Egyptian rule in the Sudan in the 1880s. He drew his inspiration from Sufism, mysticism. He was able to create a state based upon Islam and modeled upon the community of the Prophet and his companions. After his death, the Khalifa carried on the state, which was ended by the British occupation in 1898. The reforming and foreign governments felt the fear of such religious movements and attempted to control them or oppose them. It was at Durman, it's the name of a town, on the banks of the Nile that witnessed the East-West, South-North confrontation. The battle was between the Sudanese desert tribesmen, who numbered around 52,000, against the military might of the biggest empire and Kitchener's men, who numbered around 20,000. The battle was over in 5 hours, and Kitchener remarked arrogantly that the enemy had been given a good dusting. In the novel, Kitchener says to Mahmoud Wad Ahmad, after his defeat at the Battle of Atbara, "Why have you come to my country to lay waste and plunder?" It was the intruder who said this to the person whose land it was, and the owner of the land bowed his head and said nothing. Mustafa Said resumes the Battle of Durman more than 3 decades later, with the same spears and swords, the victims being the British woman rather than the British Army. He says, "I resumed the war with bow and sword and spear and arrows. The city was transformed into an extraordinary woman, and with her symbols and her mysterious calls, towards whom I drove my camels." Now I will examine the post-colonial Arab discourse during the Nahda. Frantz Fanon, in his book The Wretched of the Earth, says that colonial domination manages to disrupt in spectacular fashion the cultural life of a conquered people. The contact between the Arab world and the Western one during the Nahda signaled the beginning of the debate between traditionalism and modernism. The term Nahda, for those who don't know, literally means awakening or renaissance, and it covers the period from the mid or late 19th century to the present. During this period, the impact of the West became a major factor in Arab social and political life. Europe as the self recognized itself as different, as modern and different from the non-modern other, the Orient. With the expanding power of Europe, the question to be answered was the following: how could Arab Muslims acquire the strength to confront Europe and become part of the modern world? Europe was seen as an adversary and also as a challenge to the Arabs. The Arab awakening can be seen as a struggle between two standpoints. The first adhered to Islam as a source of legitimacy, and the second took the West as a model to aspire to or to imitate. Many regarded modernity as uniquely and strictly a European phenomenon. The most prominent representatives of the Islamic modernists or reformers, like Rafa' al-Tahtawi, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, and Muhammad Abdu, were opposed to Western domination. However, they appreciated the Western scientific and cultural achievements. They realized that living in the modern world requires certain changes, which could be carried out while Muslims remain true to themselves and to their identity. In conclusion, the religious reformers aimed at the following. They tried to reconcile tradition and modernity, hoping that the Muslim world can overcome the challenges it was facing. They stressed the need to return to the original sources of Islam. Taha Hussein, a famous novelist and prominent literary figure, took the second position. The West should be taken as a model to imitate, he asserted. I quote, "We must follow the path of the Europeans, as to be their equals and partners in civilization, in its good and evil, its sweetness and bitterness, what can be loved or hated, what can be praised or blamed." Now I will examine the character of the narrator, Al-Rawi. He was a storm-swept feather, Risha fi mahab al-rih, in the north, i.e. the other in England. Then he became a storm-swept feather in the south, the other in his own country, in the Sudan. The first page of Season announces the return of the narrator, Al-Awda, to his people after an absence of 7 years in England, where he received a doctorate degree in English literature. He rejoices leaving the coldness of England and returning to the warmth of his people in that small village at the bend of the Nile. He returns with great yearning, al-Hanin, and he feels a sense of stability. He says, "I felt not like a storm-swept feather, but like that palm tree, a being with a background, with roots, with a purpose." These feelings are reassured every time he visits his grandfather, Hajj Ahmad. He reveals a desire to seek roots in the village and to re-engage himself in his society and culture. The grandfather stands for the traditional, immutable man who has the secret of life, and it is to live simply and die simply. عدم الإسراف في الحياة. A simple and traditional life that both the narrator and Mustafa Saeed were not able to lead. Contrary to Mustafa, the narrator considers the North is very much like the South. He says, this is an important passage in your book, "Over there is like here, neither better nor worse. But I am from here, just as the date palm standing in the courtyard of our house has grown in our house and not in anyone else's. The fact that they, i.e. the British, came to our land, I know not why. Does that mean that we should poison our present and our future? Sooner or later, they will leave our country. The railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools will be ours. After spending some time in his village, the narrator goes to Khartoum to teach pre-Islamic Arabic poetry at a secondary school in Khartoum. He feels that life is good and the world remains the same. Yet the narrator has not remained the same. Contrary to his affirmation that I too had lived with them, but I had lived with them superficially, neither loving nor hating them. According to the narrator, imperialism and the coming of the British was neither a tragedy nor yet a blessing. This view differs radically from that of Mustafa, as we shall see later. He idealizes his country and his people, only to realize later that things have changed and the world has turned upside down. No sooner does he find that the love he wants to flow from his heart has turned into rage and anger. Mustafa Saeed disappears one day, by drowning or more possibly by suicide. We don't know. And he leaves his wife, Husna, and the two boys in the care of the narrator. The narrator falls in love with Husna bint Mahmoud, yet he does nothing. He does not let love flow from his heart, as he claims at the beginning of season. He says, I want to give lavishly, I want love to flow from my heart, to ripen and bear fruit. Now I will discuss the crisis of internal migration. So migration is not only geographic, that appears in your title, or the Arab-Arab conflict, we can call it the South-South conflict. There are two reasons for the narrator's alienation, al-hujra or al-ghurba. One is patriarchy and tragedy. Two, the neocolonialism, the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. All of you have encountered patriarchy in Simone de Beauvoir's work. Patriarchy. Wad Rais, a 70-year-old man, much married and much divorced, wants to marry Husna, who is very decisive when she says that she will go to no man and threatens to kill him and kill herself if they force her to marry him. In that small village at the bend of the Nile, we see the same duality between the self and the other that Simone de Beauvoir refers to in The Second Sex. A woman, she says, is simply what man decrees. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. Wad Rais argues that men are guardians of woman and that she will marry him whether she likes it or not. He says that God said in his noble book that children are the adornment of life. النساء والبنون زينة الحياة. Only to be corrected by the narrator who recites the verse as it stands in the Quran. It is wealth and children, al-mal wal-banun, are the adornment of life. Her father forces her to marry him, and few days after the marriage, she kills him and kills herself. Mabruka, Wad Rais' first wife, and the narrator are the only two people in the village who do not curse Husna. However, their reasons are quite different. The narrator confesses that Husna bint Mahmoud was the only woman he had loved. Haj Ahmad prays to God to rest the soul of Wad Rais, bitraham alayh, curses all women whom he considers sisters of the devil. Second reason for the internal migration of the narrator or the alienation is the corruption of the new rulers of Africa. The alienation of the narrator multiplies. He attends a conference of the Ministry of Education to discuss ways of unifying the educational methods. The conference is held in the Independence Hall, notice the name of the hall, in a hotel in Khartoum. The hall was designed in London, the white marble imported from Italy. The minsters are dressed in silk, mohair, and cashmere. The cost of the hall, around £1 million, and the wealth of the minsters stand in sharp contrast to the poverty of the Sudanese, who lack schools and lack hospitals. The minister in his speech considers the bourgeoisie as being more dangerous to the future of Africa than imperialism. It is the same minister who leads a very bourgeois life. He is known to be corrupt and has amassed a fortune from the sweat of the poor, wretched, half-naked people in the jungle. The narrator starts considering going back to the north. He says, "There is no room for me here. Why don't I pack up and go?" Twice in the novel does the narrator say, "There is no justice or moderation in the world." The first time he says this statement is after attending the conference in Khartoum. The second time when he describes the courtroom scene in London, where Isabella Seymour's husband stands to defend his wife in spite of the fact that she confessed to him her relationship with Mustafa. He says he feels no bitterness towards her and expresses his deep sadness at losing her. The narrator feels bitterness and hatred. The unfaithful wife is being defended by her husband, and the faithful Husna suffers a tragic fate in that patriarchal village at the bend of the Nile. He says, "I feel bitterness and hatred, for after all these victims, he crowned his life yet with another one, Husna bint Mahmoud, the only woman I have ever loved." Now I will examine the character of the second voice in the novel, which is Mustafa Said's voice. Mustafa Said is the second voice in season. We can notice the dissimilarity with the narrator from the first few pages of the novel, and clearly after he starts his confessions on page 19. It is specifically on this page that the author, Tayib Saleh, got stuck and read more than once what you read at the beginning of the semester, Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Especially Freud's theory of man as being divided between Eros and Thanatos. Mustafa Said was born in Khartoum in 1898. Notice the date. It's the same year of the Battle of Durman. He decides to avenge the colonization of the Sudan, but under his own terms. He conceives his relationship with the English woman as a battle, inflicting pain and suffering on them, and treating his victims as Kitchener treated his native people, the Sudanese. As a child, he was raised by his mother. His father died before he was born. He lives with his mother like strangers, and they act as relatives to each other. He is described as isolated, arrogant. His mind is like a sharp knife, and his heart is as cold as a piece of ice. Nothing in the world could shake him. He pursues his education at a local school, so you have 3 stops in his life. First, the Sudan, then attends a school in Cairo, and then leaves to London, where he receives a doctorate degree in economics from the University of London. He says, more than once, "The mysterious call led me to the coast of Dover, to London, and tragedy." He lives in England for 30 years, but is insensitive to its beauty. He enjoys nothing. Mustafa is concerned only with his campaign of inflicting pain and suffering upon the English woman. He uses terms of Arab military campaigns every time he goes out to find a new victim. He says, "By day I lived with the theories of Keynes and Tony, and at night I resumed the war with bow and sword and spear and arrows. I saw the troops returning filled with terrors." He saddles his camels, refers to the Arab army conquering Spain in the 8th century, and claims that one of his forefathers was a soldier in the army of Tariq ibn Ziyad. The connection in Mustafa Said's mind between sexual conquest and his war on British colonialism is very evident. The description of his sexual conquests are similar to that of a military conquest. He says, "Yes, my dear sirs, I came as an invader into your very homes, a drop of the poison which you have injected into the veins of history." If we examine Mustafa's character outside the historical and colonial context, his role would be reduced to a womanizer and a seducer. His bedroom becomes a battlefield, a theater of war. Now I will examine few levels of Mustafa Said's character. First level is the Freudian one. Mustafa Said represents on one level a man divided between Eros and Thanatos. The death instinct is directed both inward towards himself and outward towards his woman victims. He confesses in the courtroom that he killed Jane Morris and killed her intentionally, as if he wants to die in the North. But they sentence him to imprisonment of 7 years. But the distant call still rings in his ears. He says, "It's futile to deceive oneself. That distant call still rings in my ears. I thought that my life and marriage here would silence it." As for Jane Morris, he marries her after pursuing her for 3 years. He knows she's a woman who abstains from nothing, cheating, lying, or stealing. He knows she's being unfaithful to him, and often asks himself what it was that bound him to her. The natural reaction is for him to leave her. Instead, he obeys the pleasure principle, decides to stay with her, completely controlled by his id, given in to his desires. His love to her is the icy battlefield from which he would not make a safe return. He is the sailor, and she is the shore of destruction. He says, "I was in torment, and in a way I could not understand. I derived pleasure from my suffering." The second level of Mustafa Said's character is the South-North dichotomy or love-hatred relationship. Mustafa Said's relationship with the West is one of defiance and yearning. There are many times in the novel where Mustafa Said says that he is South that yearns for the North and the ice. It is the same North that he is waging war against. His apartment in London is full of Persian rugs with the smell of incense and Eastern perfumes. The narrator, visiting the secret room of Mustafa Said in the village, describes it as a graveyard, a huge joke. It is packed with English books and not a single Arabic book. It has a fireplace in the middle and 2 Victorian chairs. The room resembles an English apartment planted in a totally different cultural space, that is, in a Sudanese village, while his apartment in London has the oriental grandeur of the Arab world. His love to Jane Morris unfolds the same dichotomy: love, defiance, and hatred. After putting the blade edge between her breasts, He confesses his love to her. It was the night of truth and the night of tragedy. The third level is Mustafa Said as both conqueror and conquered, a modern yet a traditional man. Mustafa Said is both conqueror and conquered. I have come to you as a conqueror, are his words every time a new victim, a new woman falls for him. The narrator describes it as a melodramatic phrase. Unable to forget that he's at the same time the Arab African, he tells Isabella that I seek not glory, for the likes of me do not seek glory. The two halves of Mustafa Said represent the Sudanese traditional man and the modern London intellectual. The economist and university lecturer. Nowhere does he emerge in the novel as fully traditional or fully modern. He is not a truly modern individual, nor a genuinely traditional one, probably because of the impact of both forces, his past identity and Western education. In The Secret Room, the narrator finds an unwritten biography of Mustafa Said with a one-line dedication. Opening a notebook, I read on the first page my life story. On the next page was the dedication to those who see with one eye, speak with one tongue, and see things as either black or white, either Eastern or Western. The dedication limits any possibility of encounter between the East and the West. One interpretation is that his life story is dedicated, perhaps, to those who see the coming of the British as a blessing, a civilizing mission. Also, someone like Richard, an English economist who affirms that the Arabs cannot manage to live without the British, and that their presence, that is, the presence of the British, is indispensable. The narrator speaks of the railways, ships, hospitals, factories, and schools that will be ours soon. What Mustafa Said establishes is something, a very different view. He says, the ships sailing the Nile were carrying guns, not bread, and the railways were set up to transport troops. The schools were started to teach the Sudanese how to say yes in English. It could as well be read as a dedication to a being who sees things as entirely Eastern or entirely Western, who is not both traditional and modern, someone without a divided self. Now, the contradictory selves of Mustafa Said. Mustafa lives and becomes a lie. He is Hassan, Charles, Amin, Mustafa, and Richard. When Isabella Seymour asks him about his race, he answers, I am like Othello, Arab African. Addresses the jury and prosecutors in the courtroom saying, I am no Othello, I am a lie. Why don't you sentence me to be hanged and so kill the lie? So who is Othello? Tobias?
Yeah, just some brief remarks for you about Othello, for those of you who are not familiar with him. Othello is the main character in one of Shakespeare's plays. He's a cultural and racial outsider living in Venice. However, his military and leadership skills are valuable to the state, and hence he becomes an integral part of Venetian society. Othello occasionally, however in a seemingly conscious manner, presents himself as the outsider, possibly because he recognizes his exotic appeal. In the beginning of the play, Othello is not referred to by his name, but rather through the impersonal him or he. He is more often than not reduced to his race. He is the Moor, the Black Ram, the Barbary horse, and so on. He is always the other.
Okay, so Othello is the other, of course, is the Moor of Venice, who was able to marry the daughter of the governor of Venice, the beautiful Desdemona. He's described as the black ram. Oh, okay. Thank you, Thomas. He's described as the Barbary horse, the black ram, the other. Okay. He is the tragic man, a hero with a flaw. Following his instincts and irrational desires, believes that his loyal wife, Desdemona, is a whore on the slightest of evidence, smothers her face with a pillow on their marriage bed. He says, "Speak of me as I am, then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well." Those were Othello's last words before stabbing himself. At the end of the novel, we find the narrator trapped halfway in the river between south and north. And for the first time in his life, he takes a decision, the decision to stay in the Sudan. All my life, I had not chosen, had not decided. Now I am making a decision. I choose life. Like a comic actor shouting on a stage, I screamed with all my remaining strength, "Help, help." Now, is it a pessimistic or an optimistic end, or is it both at the same time? I leave it for you to decide on that. As for Mustafa Said, if his intellect and knowledge were used to develop the South, his struggle to avenge the Sudanese would have led him to the Sudan and not to Victoria Station and tragedy. Mustafa loved his country too well, but not wisely. Thank you for your attention.